Marcus Thompson had never imagined his life would fall apart so completely in just 3 days. The 26-year-old construction worker sat on a rusty metal bench at the abandoned section of Denver's Union Station train yard, watching the last passenger train of the evening disappear into the darkness. His stomach growled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten anything substantial in over 30 hours. The crisp October air cut through his thin jacket like a knife. Marcus pulled the worn denim closer around his shoulders, but it did little to stop the cold from seeping into his bones. His work boots, once sturdy and reliable, now had holes in the soles that let in every drop of moisture from the damp concrete beneath his feet. Everything he owned in the world fit into a small backpack that sat beside him, containing 2 changes of clothes, a nearly empty water bottle, and exactly $7.43 in crumpled bills and loose change. 3 months ago, Marcus had been living what he thought was a stable life in Phoenix, Arizona. He worked for Heartfelt Construction, a mid-sized company that specialized in commercial buildings. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was steady. And Marcus had managed to save up nearly $4,000 over 2 years of careful budgeting. He rented a small apartment near the job sites, drove a reliable used pickup truck, and even had a girlfriend named Sarah who worked at the local diner. But the construction industry could be brutal and unpredictable. When the housing market took a sudden downturn, Heartfelt Construction lost 3 major contracts in the span of 2 weeks. Marcus watched helplessly as his co-workers were laid off one by one. He thought his experience and work ethic might save his job, but on a sweltering Tuesday morning in July, his foreman handed him a pink slip, along with 2 weeks' pay. Sarah had been understanding at first. She encouraged Marcus to apply for unemployment benefits and helped him search for new jobs online at the public library. For 6 weeks, Marcus sent out dozens of applications, showed up at construction sites before dawn hoping for day work, and took on odd jobs whenever he could find them. But the savings dwindled quickly when he still had to pay rent, utilities, and truck payments. By September, the stress had taken its toll on their relationship. Sarah worked double shifts at the diner to help pay for groceries. But Marcus could see the exhaustion in her eyes and the way she flinched whenever he mentioned money. Their conversations became shorter and more strained. She started staying late at work, claiming she needed the extra tips, but Marcus suspected she was avoiding coming home to their problems. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening when Marcus couldn't make the truck payment for the 2nd month in a row. The repo men showed up at 6 in the morning, and Marcus watched his vehicle get towed away while he stood in the parking lot in his boxer shorts and a t-shirt. Sarah had left for work early that day, and Marcus was grateful she didn't have to witness that final humiliation. Without transportation, finding work became nearly impossible. Phoenix was a sprawling city built for cars, and the bus system couldn't get Marcus to most construction sites early enough to compete with workers who had their own vehicles. His unemployment benefits barely covered the rent, and Marcus was forced to choose between food and keeping a roof over his head. The decision was made for him when Sarah came home after a particularly long shift and found Marcus eating plain bread for dinner again. She sat down across from him at their small kitchen table, her uniform still smelling like French fry oil and coffee, and spoke in a voice so quiet Marcus had to strain to hear her. "I can't do this anymore," she said, not meeting his eyes. "My sister in California said I can stay with her for a while. There are more job opportunities there, better tips at the restaurants." Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to be angry with her. Sarah had already sacrificed so much, trying to help him stay afloat. She deserved better than watching him fail every single day. "What about us?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah finally looked at him, and Marcus saw tears forming in her brown eyes. "I love you, Marcus, but love doesn't pay the bills. I need to think about my future, and right now, I can't see one here." She moved out 3 days later. Marcus helped her pack her belongings into her friend's car, and they shared an awkward hug goodbye. Sarah pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand before she got into the passenger seat. Marcus waited until the car disappeared around the corner before unfolding it. Inside was $300 in 20s and a note that said, "Find your way back to who you were before all this happened." With Sarah gone and no way to pay the next month's rent, Marcus faced an impossible choice. He could use the $300 to buy himself another month in the apartment, but without a job or transportation, he would just be delaying the inevitable. Or he could take the money and try to start over somewhere else, somewhere with better opportunities and lower living costs. Marcus remembered his Uncle Frank mentioning that Denver had a booming construction industry, and that workers were always needed there. Uncle Frank had worked construction his whole life before retiring to a small farm outside the city. Marcus hadn't spoken to him in over 2 years, but Frank had always said family was family, and that Marcus was welcome anytime. The Greyhound ticket to Denver cost $187, leaving Marcus with just enough money for a few meals on the road. He packed everything he could carry into his old high school backpack, left the apartment keys on the kitchen counter, and walked to the bus station before he could change his mind. The 30-hour bus ride gave Marcus plenty of time to think about his plan. He would find Uncle Frank's farm, explain his situation, and ask if he could stay for a few weeks while looking for work in Denver. Frank was a good man who understood what it meant to work hard for an honest living. Marcus felt confident that his uncle would help him get back on his feet. But when the bus pulled into Denver station, Marcus realized he had a problem he hadn't considered. Uncle Frank didn't have a phone, and Marcus didn't have the exact address of the farm. He remembered it was somewhere outside the city, near a town that started with the letter B. But that was all he could recall. Marcus spent his first day in Denver at the public library, searching online for Frank Thompson in various small towns around the area, but found nothing useful. His money ran out faster than expected when he discovered that Denver was much more expensive than Phoenix. A simple sandwich cost twice what he was used to paying, and even the cheapest motel room was beyond his budget. Marcus spent his first night sleeping in the bus station, curled up on a hard plastic chair with his backpack clutched against his chest. Security guards woke him up before dawn and told him he couldn't stay there during the day unless he had a ticket for travel. Marcus wandered the downtown streets for hours, stopping at construction sites to ask about work, but most foremen took one look at his rumpled clothes and desperate expression and told him they weren't hiring. By the second night, Marcus had spent his last $5 on a gas station hot dog and a bottle of water. He tried sleeping in a downtown park, but the police moved him along after midnight. Exhausted and growing desperate, Marcus remembered seeing the train yard during his wandering. It was far enough from the main tourist areas that police probably wouldn't bother him, and there might be shelter from the wind among the old rail cars. The train yard was a mixture of active rail lines and abandoned tracks that hadn't been used in decades. Marcus found a relatively quiet section, where old freight cars sat rusting on forgotten sidings. Some of the cars had open doors that provided shelter from the weather, but they smelled of motor oil and decay. Marcus chose to sleep outside instead, finding a bench near an old signal tower that blocked some of the wind. Now, on his third night in Denver, Marcus was beginning to understand just how precarious his situation had become. His phone battery had died that morning, cutting off his last connection to the outside world. He had no way to contact potential employers, no address to put on job applications, and no money for food or transportation. The construction sites he'd visited had all told him the same thing. Come back when you clean up and have a permanent address. Marcus pulled out the crumpled bills from his pocket and counted them again, hoping somehow the amount had magically increased. $7.43, enough for maybe one more meal, if he chose carefully. After that, he would have to figure out how to survive on nothing. The sound of an approaching freight train echoed across the yard, its headlight cutting through the darkness like a white-hot knife. Marcus watched the massive locomotive pull dozens of cars past his bench, the ground vibrating beneath his feet from the immense weight. He wondered briefly about jumping on one of those cars, riding the rails to some other city where his luck might be better. But he had heard stories about railroad security and the dangers of train hopping from some of the older construction workers back in Phoenix. As the train disappeared into the night, the silence that followed seemed even deeper than before. Marcus could hear traffic from the distant highway, the occasional bark of a dog from the nearby industrial district, and his own breathing in the cold air. He tried to remember the last time he had felt truly warm and safe, but even those memories seemed to belong to someone else now. A movement in the shadows caught his attention. Marcus tensed, ready to grab his backpack and run if necessary. In his current situation, every stranger could be a threat, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized it was just a stray cat picking through some garbage near the old signal tower. The cat looked up at Marcus for a moment, its eyes reflecting what little light remained, then continued its search for food. Marcus felt a kinship with the animal. Both of them were scraping by, looking for their next meal, trying to stay warm and safe in a world that didn't seem to care whether they lived or died. The thought was both comforting and deeply depressing. He pulled his jacket tighter and tried to find a more comfortable position on the metal bench. Sleep would be difficult with the cold and the hunger, but Marcus knew he needed to rest. Tomorrow would require all his energy to continue the search for work, for food, for any opportunity to climb out of the hole he had fallen into. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain. Marcus looked up at the cloudy sky and realized he might have to find better shelter soon. The old freight cars were looking more appealing despite their unpleasant smell. At least they would keep him dry if the weather turned worse. As he gathered his backpack and prepared to move, Marcus heard something that made him freeze in place. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps approaching across the gravel and concrete of the train yard. Marcus strained his eyes trying to see who was coming, but the darkness was too complete. His heart began to race as he considered his options. He could run, but where would he go? He could try to hide, but there wasn't much cover in this section of the yard. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by the soft sound of spurs jingling with each step. Marcus had heard that sound before, growing up around ranchers and cowboys in Arizona. Someone was walking toward him wearing traditional Western riding spurs, which seemed odd for a train yard in the middle of Denver at nearly midnight. Marcus remained perfectly still, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing him. But the footsteps stopped just a few feet away from his bench, and a gruff voice spoke out of the darkness. "You look like a man who's run out of places to go." The voice was weathered and deep, like it had been aged by years of cigarettes and whiskey. Marcus still couldn't see the speaker clearly, but the tone wasn't threatening. It sounded almost sympathetic, which somehow made Marcus even more nervous. In his experience, strangers who approached homeless people in the middle of the night rarely had good intentions. "I'm not looking for trouble," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly from thirst and exhaustion. A dry chuckle came from the darkness. "Son, trouble's already found you. Question is whether you're ready to do something about it." The man stepped closer, and in the faint glow from a distant streetlight, Marcus could finally make out his features. He was probably in his early 60s, with silver hair that touched his collar and a thick mustache that had gone completely white. His face was deeply lined from years in the sun, and his eyes had the kind of steady, measuring look that Marcus associated with men who had worked outdoors their entire lives. He wore a worn leather jacket over a plain work shirt, jeans that had seen better days, and boots that were scuffed but well-maintained. The spurs Marcus had heard were small and practical, not the ornate kind worn for show. "Name's Walter Henley," the man said, extending a calloused hand. "Most folks just call me Walt." Marcus hesitated for a moment before reaching out to shake the offered hand. Walt's grip was firm but not aggressive, and his skin felt like worn leather from decades of manual labor. "Marcus Thompson," he replied, studying the older man's face for any sign of deception or threat. Walt nodded and looked around the train yard with the casual familiarity of someone who had been there many times before. "You picked a decent spot to rest, but it's gonna rain before morning. These old benches turn into rivers when the weather turns bad. How do you know it's going to rain?" Marcus asked. Though even as he spoke, he could smell moisture in the air. Walt tilted his head back and breathed deeply. "Been reading weather signs since I was shorter than a fence post. My grandfather taught me that a man who can't predict the weather has no business working outside." He gestured toward the clouds. "See how the wind's shifting from the southwest? Feel how the temperature's dropping just a degree or two every few minutes? Rain's coming, all right. Probably within the hour." Marcus felt his stomach clench with dread. He had been hoping to avoid sleeping in one of the old freight cars. But if Walt was right about the rain, he might not have a choice. "There's a diner about 6 blocks from here that stays open all night," Walt continued, as if reading Marcus's thoughts. "Coffee's terrible, but it's warm. And the waitress doesn't bother folks who nurse a cup for a few hours." "I can't afford coffee," Marcus said, embarrassed by the admission but too tired to maintain pretenses. Walt studied him for a long moment, those steady eyes taking in Marcus's worn clothing, the desperate thinness in his face, and the way he clutched his backpack like a lifeline. "When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Marcus had to think about it. Time had become fluid since arriving in Denver, marked more by the rhythm of his empty stomach than by clocks or calendars. "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the day before." "Well, that won't do at all," Walt said matter-of-factly. "Man can't think straight when he's hungry. And he sure can't work worth a damn. Come on." Walt started walking toward the edge of the train yard, his spurs creating a rhythmic jingling that somehow made the desolate place seem less threatening. Marcus grabbed his backpack and hurried to catch up, his mind racing with questions and concerns. Every survival instinct he had developed over the past few days told him not to trust strangers, especially ones who approached him in abandoned train yards at midnight. But something about Walt's manner, the straightforward way he spoke and moved, suggested he wasn't someone who meant harm. "Why are you helping me?" Marcus asked as they walked. "You don't even know me." Walt was quiet for several steps before answering. "I know enough. I know you're young and strong and probably not stupid, or you wouldn't have lasted this long on your own. I know you're not drunk or high, because your eyes are clear and your speech is steady. And I know you're scared but trying not to show it. Which means you've got some pride left in you." They reached the edge of the train yard and stepped onto a sidewalk that ran alongside a chain-link fence. The neighborhood they entered was industrial, with warehouses and small manufacturing buildings lining both sides of the street. Most of the buildings were dark at this hour, but Marcus could see lights from the diner Walt had mentioned in the distance. "I used to be where you are now," Walt said as they walked. "Different circumstances, different time, but the same feeling in my gut, like the whole world had turned its back on me." "What happened to you?" Marcus asked. Walt pulled a pack of cigarettes from his jacket pocket and lit one with a worn silver lighter. "This was back in 1982. I was working cattle on a ranch outside Cheyenne, Wyoming. Good job, decent pay, and I thought I had it made. Been there almost 8 years, worked my way up from the bottom, saved enough money to put a down payment on some land of my own." He took a long drag from his cigarette and exhaled slowly. Then the ranch owner died suddenly of a heart attack. His son inherited the place. And that boy had big ideas about modernizing everything. Decided he didn't need as many hands, and he especially didn't need the older guys who might question his new methods. Marcus could hear the old hurt in Walt's voice, even after all these years. "I was 34 years old, suddenly unemployed, and I'd put every penny I had into that land deal. When I couldn't make the payments, the bank took it all back. Lost my down payment, lost my credit, lost everything I'd worked for." They were getting closer to the diner now, and Marcus could see that it was a classic 1950 style establishment with red vinyl booths and chrome fixtures. The neon sign in the window flickered intermittently, casting pink and blue shadows on the wet pavement. "What did you do?" Marcus asked. "Same thing you're doing now. I wandered around feeling sorry for myself, sleeping rough, taking odd jobs when I could find them. Spent about 3 months believing that life had dealt me a hand I couldn't possibly win with." Walt stopped walking and turned to face Marcus directly. "Then I met a man who taught me something important about the difference between being broke and being beaten." "What's the difference?" "Being broke is temporary if you're willing to work and learn. Being beaten is permanent, but only if you choose to stay that way." Walt dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. "The man who told me that was sitting in the same situation you're in now, except it was a bus station in Laramie instead of a train yard in Denver." They reached the diner, and through the large windows, Marcus could see that it was nearly empty, except for a tired-looking waitress reading a paperback novel behind the counter. Walt pushed open the door, setting off a small bell that announced their arrival. The warmth inside felt like a physical embrace after the cold night air. Marcus hadn't realized how much the temperature had dropped until he stepped into the heated space. The diner smelled like coffee and fried food and disinfectant, but to Marcus, it smelled like salvation. "Sit anywhere you like, honey." the waitress called out, without looking up from her book. Walt chose a booth near the back, away from the windows and the door. The red vinyl was cracked and patched with duct tape, but the seats were comfortable enough. Marcus slid into the side facing the door, a habit he had developed over the past few days of always wanting to see who might be coming in. The waitress approached with 2 coffee cups and a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the previous day. She was probably in her 50s, with bleached blonde hair and the kind of tired friendliness that came from years of serving food to strangers. "What can I get you boys tonight?" she asked, filling their cups without waiting for an answer. "2 of the breakfast specials," Walt said. "Eggs over easy, hash browns, bacon, and toast." Marcus started to protest. "I can't pay for—" "I didn't ask if you could pay for it," Walt interrupted gently. "I said that's what we're having." The waitress scribbled on her order pad and headed back toward the kitchen. Marcus wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, letting the heat seep through his palms and warm his fingers. The coffee was indeed terrible, bitter and overcooked. But it was hot and caffeinated, and better than anything he had tasted in days. "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked again. Walt sipped his coffee and made a face at the taste. "I told you I was in your shoes once. Man named Charlie Morse helped me out when I needed it most." Big old cowboy with hands like dinner plates and a voice that sounded like he'd been eating gravel for breakfast. "What did he do for you?" "Gave me 3 things," Walt said, holding up fingers to count them off. "First, he gave me a meal and a place to sleep for a few nights. Second, he gave me some work to do so I could earn a few dollars and feel like a human being again instead of a charity case. And third, he gave me some advice that changed the way I looked at my whole situation." The food arrived faster than Marcus had expected, 2 large plates loaded with more calories than he had consumed in the past 3 days combined. The eggs were perfectly cooked, the hash browns crispy and golden, and the bacon was thick-cut and still sizzling. Marcus forced himself to eat slowly, even though his body wanted to inhale everything in sight. "What was the advice?" he asked between bites. "Charlie told me that every man's life has turning points. Moments when everything changes direction, whether he wants it to or not. He said the mistake most people make is thinking they're victims of those turning points instead of understanding that they're opportunities." Walt cut into his eggs and let the yolk run across his plate. "He said that when life knocks you down to nothing, it's actually giving you a gift. It's showing you what you're really made of underneath all the comfortable assumptions and safety nets." Marcus thought about that as he ate. For the past few months, he had felt like nothing but a victim. Victim of economic forces beyond his control. Victim of bad timing. Victim of circumstances that seemed determined to grind him into the ground. But listening to Walt talk about turning points made him wonder if there was another way to look at his situation. "So what happened after you met Charlie?" Marcus asked. "He put me to work on a ranch about 50 miles south of Laramie. Nothing fancy, just basic maintenance and fence repair. But it paid decent wages and came with a bunk in the ranch house. I worked there for about 6 months, saved up some money, and started looking around for opportunities." Walt paused to drink more coffee, and Marcus noticed how the older man's eyes seemed to focus on something far away, as if he was seeing events from decades past. "I realized that I'd been thinking too small before. Instead of just working for other people and hoping they'd treat me fairly, I started thinking about what I could do for myself. Used my savings to buy an old pickup truck and some basic tools, then started hiring myself out as a handyman to ranchers and farmers in the area. Did it work? Better than I expected. Turns out there's always demand for someone who can fix things, especially in rural areas where specialists are hard to find. I learned to repair everything from windmills to barn doors to irrigation systems. Within 2 years, I had more work than I could handle by myself." Walt finished his eggs and leaned back in the booth. "By the time I was 40, I owned 3 trucks, employed 6 other men, and had enough money saved to buy that land I'd lost. Not the same piece, but better land in a better location." Marcus felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope he had been clinging to in Phoenix, but something more solid and realistic. If Walt could rebuild his life from nothing, maybe there was a path forward that Marcus hadn't considered. "The key," Walt continued, was understanding that I couldn't go back to being the man I was before I lost everything. That version of myself had made decisions and assumptions that led to failure. I had to become someone different. Someone who thought differently about work, and money, and security. The waitress refilled their coffee cups and left the check on the table. Walt glanced at it, and pulled a $20 bill from his wallet, leaving it next to the paper without bothering to check the amount. Outside, the first drops of rain began hitting the diner's windows, just as Walt had predicted. Marcus watched the water streak down the glass and felt grateful to be warm and dry and fed for the first time in days. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked. Walt looked at him with those steady, measuring eyes. "Now you have a choice to make. You can go back to that train yard, spend the night getting soaked in the rain, and keep wandering around Denver hoping someone will hand you a job out of the kindness of their hearts. Or you can come with me and start learning how to build something new." "Come with you where?" "I've got a small ranch about 30 miles south of here. Nothing fancy, just 40 acres and a decent house. I'm getting too old to handle all the maintenance myself, and I've been thinking about taking on someone who's willing to work hard and learn fast." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. This seemed too good to be true, and his experience over the past few months had taught him to be suspicious of anything that seemed too easy. "What's the catch?" he asked. Walt smiled for the first time since Marcus had met him. "The catch is that it's hard work for low pay, at least at first. You'd be doing everything from mucking out horse stalls to repairing fences to helping with the cattle. Long days, early mornings, and you'd be living in a small cabin that needs some work before winter really sets in." "That doesn't sound like a catch. That sounds like exactly what I need." "The real catch," Walt said, his expression becoming serious again, "is that you'd be working for me, and I don't accept anything less than a man's best effort. I won't tolerate drinking on the job, showing up late, or half-hearted work. I've fired men twice your size for not pulling their weight." Marcus thought about everything Walt had told him, about turning points and opportunities and becoming someone different. He thought about Charlie Morse and the gift of being knocked down to nothing. He thought about Sarah and Uncle Frank and all the bridges he had burned or lost over the past few months. "What exactly did you mean when you said my path concludes with you?" Marcus asked. Walt's eyes grew distant again, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I meant that the path you've been on, the one that led you to that train yard tonight, that path ends here. Tomorrow, if you choose to come with me, you start on a different path entirely." The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the diner's roof with increasing intensity. Marcus watched people hurry past the windows, hunched over against the weather, and realized that he had reached the moment Walt was talking about. This was his turning point. His opportunity to choose what kind of man he wanted to become. "When do we leave?" Marcus asked. Walt finished his coffee and stood up. "Right now, if you're ready. My truck's parked around the corner, and I'd rather drive in the rain than wait for it to get worse." Marcus grabbed his backpack and followed Walt toward the door. As they stepped outside into the storm, he felt the cold rain hit his face and realized that for the first time in months, he wasn't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. The drive to Walt's ranch took nearly an hour through winding mountain roads made treacherous by the steady rain. Marcus sat in the passenger seat of Walt's well-maintained Ford pickup, watching the headlights cut through the darkness and illuminate pine trees and rocky outcroppings that seemed to lean in from both sides of the narrow road. The truck was old but clean, with a CB radio mounted under the dashboard and the kind of wear patterns that came from years of practical use rather than neglect. Walt drove with the casual confidence of someone who had traveled these roads thousands of times before, one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting on the gear shift. The radio played country music at low volume, and the heater worked well enough to keep the cab comfortable despite the storm outside. "Tell me about the work," Marcus said, breaking a comfortable silence that had lasted for miles. "Ranch work is different from construction," Walt replied, downshifting as they approached a steep grade. "In construction, you build something and move on to the next project. On a ranch, you're maintaining a living system. The land, the animals, the buildings, they all need constant attention." "What kind of animals?" 30 head of cattle, mostly Angus. 6 horses, though only 4 of them are still good for riding. Some chickens, a few goats, and one ornery old bull named Augustus who thinks he owns the place. Walt chuckled. Augustus and I have an understanding. He doesn't try to kill me. And I make sure he gets the best hay. They passed a wooden sign that read, Henley Ranch, established 1987, and turned onto a gravel driveway that wound between fence posts and pasture land. Marcus could see lights in the distance, a warm yellow glow that suggested home and safety, and all the things he had been missing for months. The ranch house was a simple two-story structure with a wide front porch and several outbuildings scattered around the property. Walt parked near the main house and killed the engine. And for a moment, they sat listening to the rain drumming on the truck's roof. Your cabin's about 100 yards behind the house, Walt said. It's small, but it's got everything you need. Bed, wood stove, kitchenette, and a bathroom that works most of the time. Previous fellow who worked for me left some clothes and basic supplies, and you're welcome to anything that fits. They made a dash through the rain to the front porch of the main house, where Walt unlocked the door and gestured for Marcus to follow him inside. The interior was masculine and practical, with worn leather furniture, book-lined shelves, and the kind of decorative touches that suggested a man who had been living alone for many years. The walls were covered with photographs of cattle, horses, and landscapes, along with a few faded pictures of Walt with other cowboys at various ranches and rodeos. Coffee's better here than at the diner, Walt said, moving toward a kitchen that looked well-equipped despite its age. You want some before I show you to the cabin? Marcus nodded, grateful for any excuse to delay going back out into the rain. Walt prepared the coffee with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the same routine thousands of times. And soon, the kitchen was filled with the rich aroma of freshly ground beans. I should tell you something, Walt said as he poured 2 mugs full. I'm not doing this purely out of the goodness of my heart. I need help around here, and finding reliable workers isn't easy. Most young men these days want jobs with air conditioning and regular hours. I'm not looking for easy work, Marcus said. Good, because you won't find it here. We're up before sunrise every day, rain or shine. Animals don't care about weekends or holidays or whether you're feeling under the weather. They need food and water and attention every single day. Walt handed Marcus a mug and leaned against the kitchen counter. But if you stick with it, if you really apply yourself, you'll learn skills that can take you anywhere. Ranching teaches you about responsibility, about reading weather and land and animals. It teaches you to fix things with whatever's available, and to plan ahead for problems before they happen. How long did your last worker stay? Marcus asked. About 8 months. Good kid, but he got an offer to work in the oil fields up north for more money than I could pay. Can't say I blamed him for taking it. Walt sipped his coffee thoughtfully. The one before him lasted 3 years. Saved up enough money to buy his own small place over near Colorado Springs. They drank their coffee while the storm raged outside, and Marcus felt some of the tension of the past few days beginning to ease from his shoulders. For the first time since leaving Phoenix, he was warm and dry and had a full belly and a plan for tomorrow that didn't involve wandering the streets looking for work that didn't exist. What do you pay? Marcus asked. $800 a month to start, plus room and board. If you work out, we'll talk about increasing that after 6 months. It's not much by city standards, but you won't have expenses for rent or utilities or food, so you can save most of it if you're careful. Marcus did some quick mental arithmetic. $800 a month was barely half what he had been making in construction. But Walt was right about the lack of expenses. If he could live frugally, he might be able to save $500 or $600 every month. In a year, that would give him enough to make a real new start somewhere if he decided to move on. There's one more thing, Walt said, setting down his empty mug. I don't want you thinking of this as charity or temporary help. If you're going to work for me, you're going to earn every penny I pay you. And if you're going to live on my land, you're going to treat it with respect. I understand. Do you? Because in my experience, men who've been down on their luck sometimes have a hard time adjusting to being useful again. They get lazy or resentful or start thinking the world owes them something. I won't tolerate that attitude. Walt's tone wasn't harsh, but it carried the kind of authority that came from years of managing men and animals and difficult situations. Marcus recognized it from some of the better construction foremen he had worked for, the ones who demanded excellence but were fair in return. "I won't let you down," Marcus said. "See that you don't. Now let's get you settled before this storm gets any worse." The cabin was exactly what Walt had described. Small, practical, and showing signs of recent vacancy. The previous occupant had left behind some work clothes, a few paperback novels, and basic kitchen supplies. The bed was narrow but comfortable, and the wood stove was already loaded with kindling and split logs. Walt showed Marcus how to work the sometimes temperamental bathroom plumbing and explained that hot water was limited, so short showers were appreciated. "We start at 5:30 tomorrow morning," Walt said as he prepared to leave. "I'll knock on your door the first few times until you get used to the schedule. After that, you're responsible for getting yourself up and ready." Marcus spent his first night on the ranch, sleeping more soundly than he had in weeks. The cabin was quiet, except for the sound of rain on the roof and the occasional lowing of cattle in the distance. For the first time since leaving Phoenix, he felt safe enough to truly relax. The next morning began what would become a routine that would reshape every aspect of Marcus's life. Walt's knock came at exactly 5:30, and within minutes, Marcus was dressed in borrowed work clothes and following the older man through the pre-dawn darkness toward the barn. The work was indeed hard, but it was also satisfying in ways that Marcus hadn't expected. Feeding the cattle required loading heavy bales of hay onto a truck and distributing them across several pastures while the animals gathered around, steaming in the cold morning air. Mucking out the horse stalls was dirty and physically demanding, but Marcus found himself enjoying the rhythm of the work and the way the horses nickered softly when he entered their stalls. Walt was a patient but demanding teacher. He showed Marcus how to read the subtle signs that indicated whether an animal was healthy or sick, how to repair fence wire that had been damaged by weather or livestock, and how to operate and maintain the various pieces of equipment that kept the ranch running. He explained the economics of ranching, the delicate balance between feed costs and cattle prices, and the dozens of small decisions that had to be made every day. "A ranch is like a big, complicated machine," Walt told Marcus one morning as they repaired a water pump that supplied one of the pastures. "Every part has to work properly, or the whole system breaks down. You can't just ignore problems and hope they'll go away." As the weeks passed, Marcus began to understand what Walt had meant about becoming a different person. The work was changing him physically, adding muscle to his frame and calluses to his hands. But more importantly, it was changing the way he thought about problems and solutions. In construction, when something broke, you usually called a specialist or ordered new parts. On the ranch, you fixed things with whatever materials were available, and you learned to anticipate problems before they became critical. Walt proved to be an excellent judge of character and ability. He gradually increased Marcus's responsibilities, teaching him to operate the tractor, to assist with veterinary care for sick animals, and to make basic repairs to the ranch's buildings and equipment. Marcus discovered that he had an aptitude for mechanical work, and Walt encouraged him to learn more about engines and hydraulics and electrical systems. "A man who can fix things will never be out of work," Walt told him one afternoon as they rebuilt the engine on an old hay baler. "Doesn't matter where you go, people always need things repaired." The first month was the hardest. Marcus's body ached constantly as it adapted to the physical demands of ranch work, and there were moments when he questioned whether he had made the right choice. But gradually, he began to find a sense of pride and accomplishment in his daily tasks. When he successfully delivered a calf during a difficult birth, when he repaired a gate that had been giving Walt trouble for months, when he noticed early signs of illness in a steer and caught the problem before it became serious, Marcus felt a satisfaction that was different from anything he had experienced in construction. The isolation was initially challenging. The nearest town was 20 miles away, and Marcus didn't have transportation beyond Walt's truck, which was usually needed for ranch business. But he discovered that he enjoyed the solitude more than he had expected. The constant noise and pressure of city life had been replaced by the natural rhythms of sunrise and sunset, changing seasons, and the daily needs of the animals. Walt proved to be an interesting companion. During the long winter evenings, they often sat in the main house drinking coffee and talking about everything from politics to philosophy to the proper way to break a young horse. Walt was well-read despite his lack of formal education, and he had strong opinions about most subjects. He had traveled extensively during his younger years, working on ranches from Montana to Texas, and his stories provided Marcus with an education in Western history and culture. "The thing about ranch work," Walt said one evening as they sat by the fireplace, "is that it connects you to something bigger than yourself. You're not just making money or keeping busy. You're taking care of the land and the animals, and they take care of you in return." As spring arrived, Marcus began to understand the cyclical nature of ranch life. Calving season brought long nights and constant vigilance, but also the satisfaction of seeing new life emerge and thrive. Planting and harvesting hay required intense labor during short windows of good weather, but provided the foundation for feeding the herd through the winter. Every season had its own demands and rewards. Walt also began teaching Marcus about the business side of ranching. He showed him how to read cattle market reports, how to calculate feed costs and profit margins, and how to keep records for tax and inventory purposes. Marcus discovered that he had a good head for numbers and enjoyed the strategic thinking required to manage a complex operation. "You're not going to work for other people forever," Walt told him. "If you're smart and you save your money, someday you'll have your own operation. But you need to understand the business, not just the work." By the end of his first year on the ranch, Marcus had saved over $6,000 and had learned skills he never could have imagined mastering. He could deliver a calf, repair a diesel engine, predict weather changes by reading cloud formations, and manage complex schedules for feeding, breeding, and medical care for dozens of animals. More importantly, he had regained his confidence and his sense of purpose. Walt raised his pay to $1,000 a month and began giving him more independence in managing day-to-day operations. Marcus was essentially running the ranch while Walt focused on the business and financial aspects. It was a level of responsibility that Marcus had never experienced, and he thrived under the pressure. During his second year, Marcus began to think seriously about the future. He had saved enough money to make a substantial down payment on land of his own, and Walt had been teaching him about evaluating properties and assessing their potential for livestock operations. But Marcus was surprised to discover that he wasn't eager to leave the Henley Ranch. "This place feels like home," he told Walt one evening. "I know I should be thinking about moving on, but I can't imagine working anywhere else." Walt smiled and poured himself another cup of coffee. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. I've been thinking about the future myself, and I've got a proposition for you." Walt explained that he was getting tired of the physical demands of ranch work and was thinking about transitioning to a more supervisory role. He offered to make Marcus a partner in the operation, with an eventual goal of Marcus taking over complete ownership as Walt moved toward retirement. "I don't have children to leave this place to," Walt said, "and I've watched you grow from a broken-down drifter into one of the most capable ranch hands I've ever worked with. You understand what this land means, and you have the skills to make it thrive." The partnership arrangement would allow Marcus to gradually buy into the ranch over a period of years, using his labor and management skills as equity, while also making cash payments from his wages. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that Marcus had dreamed about, but never believed he would find. 3 years after that night in the train yard, Marcus found himself the co-owner of a successful ranch operation with plans to expand into breeding quarter horses. He had saved nearly $20,000, owned his own truck, and had developed a reputation in the local agricultural community as someone who could solve difficult problems and manage complex projects. The transformation was so complete that Marcus sometimes had difficulty remembering the desperate, broken man he had been when Walt found him. The skills he had learned on the ranch had given him confidence and competence that extended far beyond livestock and farming. He served on the board of the local Cattlemen's Association, had started a small side business repairing farm equipment, and was dating a veterinarian named Lisa who appreciated his knowledge of animal husbandry. Walt's health was declining slowly but noticeably. At 68, he still insisted on working every day, but Marcus had gradually taken over most of the physical labor and much of the decision-making. They had developed an easy partnership based on mutual respect and shared goals. One evening in late fall, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Walt returned to the subject of their first meeting. "Do you remember what I told you that night in the train yard?" Walt asked. About your path concluding with me? Marcus smiled and adjusted his position in the wooden chair he had built himself from lumber salvaged from an old barn. I remember thinking you were either crazy or dangerous. Maybe both. I meant every word of it, Walt said. The path that led you to that bench. The path of being a victim and hoping someone else would solve your problems. That path ended the moment you decided to come with me. I know that now. Do you? Because I think you still don't fully understand what happened that night. Walt paused to light one of his rare evening cigarettes. I didn't find you by accident. Marcus, I went to that train yard specifically looking for someone like you. Marcus turned to look at the older man, surprised by this revelation. What do you mean? I mean that every few years, when I need help and when I'm feeling my age, I go looking for someone who's reached the end of their rope. Someone young and strong and decent, who just needs a chance to prove what they're capable of. Walt exhaled smoke into the cool evening air. Charlie Morse did the same thing for me. And his mentor did it for him. It's a tradition that goes back generations among men who work the land. We look for the ones who are down but not beaten. And we give them what they need to rebuild themselves. So, you've done this before? 4 times over the years. 2 of them didn't work out. Couldn't handle the responsibility or the isolation. But 2 of them went on to great things. One owns 3 ranches up in Montana now, and the other started a custom farming operation that serves half of Nebraska. Marcus felt a strange mixture of gratitude and insignificance. He had thought his rescue was unique, a chance encounter that had changed his life. Learning that it was part of a larger pattern made him feel both more and less special. Why didn't you tell me this before? Marcus asked. Because you needed to believe that you earned everything you got here through your own efforts. And you did. I gave you opportunity. But you did the work. I taught you skills. But you had the intelligence to learn them. I offered you partnership, but you proved you deserved it. Walt finished his cigarette and flicked the butt into a coffee can he kept on the porch for that purpose. The tradition doesn't stop with you. Marcus, someday, when you're my age and this ranch is all yours, you'll find yourself driving through town late at night and seeing someone who reminds you of yourself at your lowest moment. And if you're the man I think you are, you'll stop and offer them the same chance I offered you. Marcus understood then what Walt had really meant about his path concluding. It wasn't just about ending his old life and starting a new one. It was about joining a chain of mentorship and opportunity that stretched back through generations of Western men who understood that success meant helping others succeed. What happened to Charlie Morse? Marcus asked. He died about 10 years ago. But not before he saw me become successful enough to help others. That's what he wanted more than anything. To know that the tradition would continue. The sun disappeared behind the mountains, and the temperature began to drop with the suddenness that characterized high-altitude evenings. Walt stood up slowly, his joints protesting after a long day of work. I'm proud of the man you've become, Marcus, he said. More proud than I ever was of my own accomplishments. Charlie would have been proud too. As Walt went inside to prepare for bed, Marcus remained on the porch, looking out over the land that was becoming his responsibility and thinking about the future. The ranch was profitable and growing, his skills were constantly improving, and he had finally found the sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from his life. But more importantly, he understood now that his transformation was part of something larger than his own success. He was a link in a chain that connected him to men he had never met. Men who had faced their own moments of despair and found the strength to rebuild themselves and help others do the same. Marcus thought about the train yard in Denver, about the desperate man he had been just a few years earlier, and about all the desperate people who were sitting in similar places at this very moment. Someday, when the time was right, he would go looking for one of them, and when he found them, he would offer them the same gift that Walt had given him, the chance to end one path and begin another. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of hay and horses and the promise of winter snow. Marcus pulled his jacket closer and smiled, thinking about the weathered cowboy who had approached him in the darkness and declared that his path would conclude there. Walt had been right, of course. The old path had ended, but the new one stretched out ahead of him like a well-maintained road leading toward mountains he was eager to climb.